Hello again, I'm Jonathan, also known as the Medieval Genie, and we're going to do a follow-up to what I was discussing last time about arming swords and how to spar with them, as well as, of course, how people might have fought in real life with them previously. So going on from one of the points I mentioned, I was talking about binding. Now this is something that's quite useful with an arming sword, because as I'd mentioned, with curved blades, they tend to, because of their curvature, or at least back curved blades anyway, they tend to chop and go around and kind of disengage, so they don't bind up as much, they kind of slip past because of their curled nature. They sort of curl away. I mean, it's just like any other round surface, it tends to cause a deflecting action. So hence, when you're cutting with a curved blade, it tends to go around and you can recover ready for another action. With a straight bladed sword, or even with an incurved sword to a degree, you do a bind. So when I say a bind, it's just simply this. Imagine it's like some sort of fantasy movie. The two people are engaged with their swords or other weapons, and they're binding up like this. Their swords are crossed, swords, other weapons, whatever, it's all crossed. Here we are, this action right here is a bind. Ignoring the fact that I was just doing that to myself, you get what I mean. So, with a bind, there are lots of things that you can do. Now, it should be mentioned first that your role of being the strong or the weak is not quite as much determined by strength, although it is important. It's a lot more determined by the leverage. So, the two halves of a sword's blade are known as the forte and the foible, the strong and the weak, respectively. So, here on the lower half is the strong, and here on the upper half is the weak. Now, if a person swings their sword at me, if we made contact so it's on my weak, what usually happens is this. I get beaten aside. Now, in the movies, this is often represented by someone just dropping their sword. That very rarely, if ever, happens. But you are still beaten aside temporarily until you recover in whatever way. But if you parry, or you are met in that bind instead on the strong, the forte, on this lower half of the sword, what tends to happen is you sort of lock and stay in place. So instead of something like just bouncing off, or being beaten away, or being disarmed, which is nonsense, with just a simple hit of the sword, if you meet up on that strong, the forte, you're very likely to end up in at least a temporary bind. So with that bind, what you're typically doing is in the strong, if we talk about the strong roll first, I'll talk about the weak roll later. So with the strong roll, let's say they've tried to swing and cut my head in two. I've done this to parry them. So then, push, we meet up. So I'm here, it's probably around close to the tip of their sword, and it's close to the hilt of my sword. So, whereas they're going to struggle to get much power going, it's a situation where they're not able to put much leverage on me, but I'm able to put a lot of leverage on them. So you'll see here, if I'm pushing against this, I can find it very easy to move the blade away. Whereas if I push against here, there is a lot of resistance. With that, if the opponent is bound here on the lower half of the sword, no matter how hard they're trying to push, they're very likely to gain any purchase. We'll be staying here for a while. If, on the other hand, I push them, easy stuff. So what will happen is, if let's say we bind like this, so I can't stab them, maybe they've bound in this direction so they can't stab me, we've crossed in a way where neither person really has any advantage. Now, if they've bound on my strong, all I have to do is just give a gentle push. Really, it is gentle. If they're very strong, you might need to put some effort into it, but usually with that much leverage, completely on towards the tip of their sword, the weak part, you just easily give it a push, and then you'll see I'm now online. So I started here offline, if I try to cut or thrust, we're bound like this. You're safe. So it doesn't really matter. If I push and gain the line, now I can thrust, I could also cut. So bearing in mind these are sharp swords, I mean obviously the one I've got right now is blunt, but a real sword would have been very sharp. If you think about cutting steak, although yes, for something like a meat cleaver, it chops through with that swing. If you're using something like a kitchen knife, there's less of that chopping with a swing, and it's more like you're doing that push, pull, almost like a sawing motion, and you're just cutting through. You'll see it when chefs cut things like vegetables. Sometimes they're doing kind of like short chops, I see, but other times they're doing that drawing motion to cut, whether it's going a push forwards or a pull backwards. It's that same sawing motion. So in that bind, if I've gained the line, I can either do that sawing motion on a person that's exposed on the opponent, or I can even start to just gain that area, run perhaps against their neck, and then just draw and come out. And that's enough to cause a cut. Yes, it's not going to be as severe a wound as doing an actual chopping motion, but you are still causing an injury to the opponent, ideally without receiving any injuries yourself. That's the ideal way to do any kind of sword sparring. So with that, like I said, you're there, bound online, and with that, you gain the line for thrusts, you gain the line for cuts, and it's a very terrifying thing. With the weak, you're playing the opposite role. So let's say I've tried swinging, or we're both kind of going at each other, and I've ended up on my foible, the weak part. So then the opponent is actually pushing me offline. Now, for the reasons I just mentioned earlier, they could well just gain an immediate advantage and do some injury to me. But not all hope is lost. There are various things that can happen. So the most frequent thing that happens is, let's say, the opponent's starting to gain the advantage, pushing me offline, we disengage and kind of reset. Maybe the person starts going backwards, maybe they even start trying to do something else. Usually it just is either in the same sort of range or often coming further back, reset, start attacking in the normal ways you know about swinging a sword, stabbing, doing all these things that you do in sparring or in a duel or whatever. But instead, if I'm being pushed offline, I can allow that to happen, and I can either, let's say they're being very forceful, perhaps even almost trying to bat my sword to the ground, I let that happen, I use the momentum of them pushing me away, perhaps even a beat that they're doing, so they're swinging down and deliberately making my sword go to the ground. I use that momentum, disengage, and then cut again. This is one thing that you can do, but bear in mind that it can be dangerous, because the entire time from the instant that you disengage from your opponent, you're free to do your action, but they're free to do whatever they want as well. So what can happen in this situation is, I'm being pushed offline, okay, I think, oh, I know, I'll swing. And then the opponent thinks, oh, he's gone, I'll swing. And then, whether they're using something like their back edge or their forward edge, or even just doing a stab, they gain the line and do an attack, I gain the line and do an attack. We both injure each other. It is not a good outcome. So instead, if I feel like it's too dangerous, to gauge how dangerous it is, if your opponent is a lot slower in their reactions and their physical movements, then yes, you could let this bind start to happen. You're being pushed offline, disengage, cut. And then, before they even realise what's happened, you get out of there before they start getting angry, and they can embrace the wounds that you've just given them. So instead, if you find that it's actually quite dangerous, they're quite quick-witted, they've got good reaction speed, they're quite physically fast in whatever ways, then you might instead want to keep in that bind temporarily. They might be trying to push you, ready to go for something like a stab to the face, or push you down to the ground so that they can disengage and cut at you. Whatever they're planning to do, interrupt that before it's too late. And you can do things like use the cross guard, you go around and then you push their sword, and then we can either end up back, like I said earlier, with a disengage, but I've bought myself a little bit of time. So if they're engaged on this sort of area, we're starting here, neither of us is online. Oops, more like here. he or she pushes my blade off the line and is of course wanting to finish me off, instead of trying to disengage, perhaps coming into them, I could start using my quillons, so these bits, the crossguard, push their blade down, and then while their blade is pushed down, I've bought myself a brief moment where whether they want to cut me, or whether they want to stab at me, it's all bound up, so we can't, you know, he or she cannot actually get me yet. Obviously this is only a brief respite because they can still disengage and try something else. And during that moment, while I've got that moment, that brief initiative, I might wish to take their sword or take their hand, disengage and cut. If we're quite far out, I can still use that brief window, disengage and cut, or disengage and thrust. A third option is that instead of letting the swords completely go, obviously while I'm out here we're completely open, so whether I'm doing a cut or even a thrust, my body is open. So the sword that was over here somewhere in that example I gave, it could still cut me, it could still thrust at me, it can gain the line and become a threat and a very dangerous thing once more. I don't really want that, so instead what I do is I can perhaps look at a half sword. Now a half sword is a very simple thing. You grab the sword's blade like this, your own sword's blade. So I've gone like this and then come around into a half sword. This means that I can manipulate it kind of like a spear, but very short and close up. So I can stab, I can perhaps look at doing cuts, I can also use bits like the quillons to hook. So let's say I've disengaged, I'm using the blade, I could, if they wish to re-engage and cut, I can parry with the sword. That's one of the important things about a half sword. Although, yes, you're getting the line to do something like a thrust, or doing something like hook their blade, hook their limbs, do stuff like that, maybe hook around the back of their head. You can use it as a bar, so I can parry from above, I can parry to the sides, I can parry below. It's a bar that you've now got for defense. So hence, in the situation I mentioned earlier, in this scenario, I can go like that. So there is this, I stab, but there is also, oh, they swing, bang! I put the sword in the way. It is now a bar with which I defend. And then perhaps I've waited for them to swing at me, I've parried them with this bar of a sword, and then in the meantime, while they're for yet another time bound up and can't do anything, I go in. And it doesn't even have to be with the point online. So let's say all of this was happening, perhaps they cut from their left, I'm cutting from my left, and we've ended up going in this direction, so if I half sword it's like this, no worries. I can still smack them with the pommel for some injury, even if it's not as much as a point, but I can also do other things like, all sorts. I can try to do grapples and disarms, throws, takedowns. I can additionally use the quillons to do hooking actions. So let's say we're down here, they're here with their sword. I can then try to go around, hook their neck, and then try to sort of throw them down. This goes a lot like unarmed martial arts, so I couldn't necessarily just hook around someone's head and go, oh, come this way, and then they fall over gently onto the ground. Of course, that's not realistic. It might set it up more something like, let's say, a leg throw. So instead of, people who do unarmed martial arts might be familiar with this, instead of binding up with their arms, you kind of, grapple around their shoulders, and then you decide, I'm going to take the legs out, and then you just kind of go, kick around behind the back of their knees, throw them onto the ground, where you do that kind of throwing action. You're doing a similar sort of thing with a sword. So instead of hooking around with your hand, you're doing it with the sword, you bind with their sword, you're hooking with your sword, and then you do the same thing again, you're kicking behind, turn, cutting them over. This looks really weird, I apologise, it's the whole COVID pandemic, I can't get a partner to show this with, but there are various actions that you can do that facilitate an unarmed style of combat, something similar to MMA, Krav Maga, Judo, those sorts of things, where instead of using your hands to do the grappling, you can use the sword's quillons to do the hooking and get a point of contact. I've seen ways in which you can use the sword's quillons to contact inside the elbows, you can use it around the wrists, you can use it around the head, you can use it around the shoulders. There are various ways. Basically, in similar ways to the hand, you can do it with a sword. There's also ways in which I've seen in specifically armoured combat where you can't cut with the sword because you can't cut through steel armour. It just doesn't happen. I don't care what sword you say you've got, it doesn't work. So instead you decide to hook under somewhere like the knee and bring it up and basically trip them over that way. Which is a similar sort of thing to if you were, let's say, pushing up at the chin, pulling under the knee and making them topple over. If you've got any background in doing unarmed martial arts, I won't tell you what to do. Once you've got this basic idea of doing things like half swording, you pretty much already know what's going to happen from there. You just copy the same sorts of things that you're used to, but your sword's quillons are now your hand, essentially. And apart from that, from this same kind of half swording, instead of using the quillons to do hooking around, so like for example around the back of the head, you can use the pommel as well. This can do grappling. So if you're wishing to grapple, same sorts of things I mentioned before, various different joints and parts, the sword itself, you can use the corner around here or here, and this sort of thing adds some leverage for doing grappling actions. So the sword is a very useful tool, not just in a this is a sharp blade, you cut with it, the other person dies. You can use the various features of the sword in ways like I mentioned to do various cuts, thrusts and binds as well. So hopefully that gave you some ideas. I'd strongly recommend you look at sources for specific techniques, or you contact with people who do unarmed martial arts, and if you've got an idea of how to do grapples, throws, disarms, takedowns, all that stuff, then they'll give you enough idea of what to do when you're using a sword to do the grappling instead. Gives you a lot of pointers in that sort of direction. So I hope that was useful, and I shall see you in the next video. Ta-ra for now.